welcome back to Damn Parenting, the podcast where we gently peel back the messy, often banana-smeared layers of modern parenting, one honest and unfiltered conversation at a time. I'm your host, Eva, and today we're diving into a challenge so universal, yet so maddening, that even the most serene amongst us might quietly lose it. Staying calm when your child is anything but. Now, if you've somehow missed our last episode in this new mini-series with our resident child psychologist, Dr. Faye from Care Psychology, I really recommend giving it a listen. That was the inaugural step in our emotional deep dive with Faye. We talked about big feelings, tiny brains, and why your toddler's meltdown in Albert Heijn is not a personal vendetta against you, although it usually feels like one. Today, we're turning up the heat, because here's a relatable horror scenario. You've had a day so long that even caffeine has abandoned you. You're juggling life and work and your last shred of sanity, when suddenly, your child decides this is the precise moment to become an emotional fireworks show. You, theoretically, are the adult. You have words, coping strategies, and a credit card for emergency chocolate. They, on the other hand, have no words, no power, and basically no impulse control. So when they lose it, it's not an act of sabotage, it's the only way they know how to say, help. So in today's episode, Faye and I will unpack why your reaction in these moments is more important than any timeout or sticker chart you can wave around. Because when your child is losing their mind, your biggest superpower is not yelling louder, it's staying calm enough to show them they're safe, even when you'd rather crawl into that dishwasher to hide. We're talking public meltdowns, the cultural obsession with good kids, and of course, giving you actual phrases and tools that you can use when your brain is quietly begging for wine and chocolate and silence. So grab your tea or coffee or wine or all, and let's get into it. Welcome back, Faye.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here for us. I guess we're just going to start with the why, and it's not a major philosophical question, but why is it so important for parents to be able to regulate their own emotions first before expecting a child to be able to manage theirs?
There's a number of reasons why it's so incredibly important. And I think one of the first ones is to de-escalate situations rather than escalate them. When you meet a child with really, really high emotions, what happens is that situation often completely escalates. And if we respond to a child in a much more emotionally regulated way, then what that then helps to do is de-escalate that situation rather than it escalating even further. So that's one really important reason that I can expand on a little bit more later. Also, to model how to manage big emotions. Children are still very much learning how to respond to certain situations, how to manage really big, uncomfortable emotions. And the more that we can model how to respond, the more they will watch and observe and learn for themselves how to respond to big emotions. And I think another reason that's also really important is to support our children in feeling understood as well. The more children feel understood, the more they feel that they're listened to, the more we show compassion and empathy towards children, the less, again, we see that escalation of big emotions. There are a number of reasons that I can expand on a little bit more, but that's just kind of a brief summary, really, of the key reason.
Last episode, you actually helped us understand the brain and the different elements of it. So can you tell us what's actually going on in the brain when it comes to when it comes to kind of trying to emotionally regulate ourselves?
Absolutely. So when a child is experiencing a big emotion, the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain, is very much taking over. And what happens is in that moment, that part of the brain becomes very, very dominant. So say, for example, you've got a child who is really frustrated because they really, really want something, and you're putting in that boundary and saying, no, you're not able to have another cookie, or you're not able to, but whatever it is that they want. In that moment, their emotion center of the brain is completely taken over and they feel emotions so intensely. But actually, what we want to do in that moment is support them to respond through the higher order thinking of the brain. So that's the prefrontal cortex. So when we're managing and responding to those situations, we don't want to appeal to the emotion side of the brain because, as I said before, that would further escalate the situation. What we want to do is to appeal to the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logical thinking and reasoning. So when, I suppose, going back to one of the points I made before about the importance of de-escalating situations rather than escalating regulating them. Thinking about kind of the brain and how it works. If we respond in an emotionally charged way and the child is responding in an emotionally charged way, experts in this field like Steve Peters, who wrote the Chimp Paradox book, talks about how it's like two chimps in the wild arguing and communicating with one another. And you're not going to get anywhere because you're going to have two emotionally charged brains communicating with one another, and it's just going to further escalate. So going back to kind of what I said before, what we need to do is to appeal to that prefrontal cortex. And the best way we can do that is through supporting them to feel regulated, supporting them to feel understood, acknowledging their emotions in that moment. But we know actually that that's sometimes really difficult as parents because we're only human. And whilst I will talk a lot about how it's important to support ourselves to regulate in tricky situations, we're not robots. And we've all had situations that we can relate to where we think, oh gosh, I totally could have handled that differently. And you'll reflect and even have a moment where you just think, oh my goodness, that did not go how I wanted it to. Regardless of how much you prepare, regardless of how much you kind of consider how you would like to respond in those moments, because sometimes our emotion center of the brain does take over because we're only human. And I suppose in those moments, it's giving ourselves that self-compassion and it's giving ourselves that grace to admit that, oh, do you know what? It's okay to sometimes get things wrong ourselves. And a key benefit of that is that when we model that self-compassion for ourselves, we support our children in having that self-compassion and understanding that actually we don't always get things right. And what is really important in that situation when things don't go as well as we would want to is repairing the situation with our children and acknowledging that you didn't get it right and apologizing to your child and saying, do you know what, mummy or daddy found that really difficult. And actually, that's not on you, that's on me. And really responding to that in a way that, again, models that self-compassion and models that we are not perfect because nobody is perfect. And however much we try to be perfect, it's absolutely impossible. So being able to be comfortable with that and be comfortable with your child in that space is actually really important. And another element kind of tied to that is if we have a situation where perhaps we don't repair, where we don't speak to our children about how we maybe could have handled things differently, what then happens is we leave our child to write their own narrative about that situation. So what we often do is we leave them considering, well, why did mummy or daddy behave in that way? And often they become the center of the problem in their own mind. So they might then develop a narrative around, oh, well, I'm naughty, I'm lazy. And actually, that's the last thing we want for our children to see themselves. We want them very much to see themselves in a positive light and to understand that actually we don't always get things right. And they don't always have to get things right, and that's okay. A great quote is, you don't need to control your child's emotions, you need to control your own. And I think that's really powerful in itself because we can't always control our child's emotions, we can't always control our child's behaviors, but we can, where possible, control our own in that situation. But as I say, every now and again, you can't always control your emotions, and sometimes we just need to take a step back and forgive ourselves in those situations.
So you said there are a few things that I just want to catch back on. You said, oh, if we don't do it right, we kind of cringe. Honestly, I have shame, I have guilt, I have just embarrassment. When I go through that, that's the true feelings that I have because I'm like, I should have known better and I'm kicking myself. And what's worse is for most human beings is admitting you're wrong is hard enough, but doing that to a child is on another level because they're sitting there kind of already stewing in themselves and a bit confused. But then this parent comes up and is like, I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And sometimes it does kind of feel like, why am I doing this? What good is this doing? So as much as I'm trying, I do still feel like I'm sure many of us have this feeling of this kind of feels stupid. And it's also just that embarrassment that can also hold us back.
It can be really tricky, can't it? It can be really tricky to, take that step back and say, do you know what, I'm really sorry, I got it wrong. It's really, really difficult. But I think sometimes a lot of the difficulties that we experience with managing our own emotions often goes back to our childhood experiences. And we're often triggered by what Dr. Hillary would describe as wounds from our childhood. So things that have happened to us where perhaps our emotional needs were not met for whatever reason. And then when we come across certain situations with our children, it really, really triggers us. It really triggers our nervous system, and our emotion center of the brain really, really takes over. And I suppose that stress response in itself is uncontrollable in that situation. But I suppose the more that you unpick what your triggers are, the more that you unpick kind of what's going on for you, the more that you can acknowledge, oh, do you know what? This situation is actually quite triggering for me. And you can take that step back. It's giving yourself that reflection time. It's giving yourself that grace and that forgiveness when you don't always get it right. And then considering, right, how can I handle that differently next time?
But I'm just thinking about new parents or people who are pregnant. Maybe that's a conversation you need to have with the partner to be like, hey, so when you're stressed, like, how are you going to deal with it? Are you going to apologize to a child? It's such a weird concept. And it's obviously from our generations, that is not happening back then for most of us. But nowadays, it's an element of what parenting style are we going to have? And how are we going to do this? Because I remember explaining to my husband about my friend who works in a daycare in Germany, and they have to ask the child if they can change their diaper, and that the child has the power to say yes or no. I remember my husband was like, well, that's insane. And then when it came to us having our own child, I remember also being like, does that have an impact? And so we tried it out, and, you know, she never had a problem with it, thankfully. But it was just that thing that you're like, oh, it's recognizing that they are a human being and giving them the equal respect that everyone deserves.
Absolutely. I was thinking about this earlier, and do you not think you don't know what you don't know?
Yeah.
And prior to having children, you would never, no, there's nothing anyone could ever tell you to fully prepare you for having children and to fully prepare you for the emotional toll that having children has on you at times. And some people have jobs where they manage really stressful situations, or where they have perhaps respond to children who are regularly emotionally dysregulated. But actually, it's a whole different ballgame when working with your own children. And I don't think you can ever fully emotionally prepare yourself for that. And I think that that's where it goes back to what I said before about giving yourself grace in these situations, because ultimately we are all human and things are not always going to go well. And also it depends on how we feel day to day as well. How much are our basic needs being met? And this was something I was also considering earlier in terms of for so many of us, we don't get enough sleep. For so many of us, we eat when we can. We're not eating probably full meals. We're not sitting down and having a rest and a break when we're actually eating. For so many of us, we're working, balancing childcare, balancing all the other cognitive load, other cognitive load that we need to deal with. And actually, how often do we just get time to ourselves? Like for me last night, my little boy was not going to sleep, and he didn't go to sleep until 9 o'clock. And then I was like, do you know what? I'm so exhausted. Even though I could do with some time to myself, like all I really needed to do was just go to sleep. But then that completely takes out any time that I've had to myself that day, because I had him all day yesterday. And thinking about kind of like your basic needs being met around getting enough sleep, having space and time to yourself, eating properly, all those key factors, so many of those key needs that are not being met. So then we're not then able to show up for our children as well as we would be able to. I really like the phrase, you can't drink from an empty cup. You can't show up for your children in a way that you want to if you've got a completely empty cup. So it's considering those factors. I know of another really common quote that is often used is you need to put your own oxygen mask on first before you put on the oxygen mask of others. But actually, it's a really important message behind that. And I often laugh because I, particularly when my little boy was younger, he used to want to spend all his time with me. And often when he didn't, there was a huge amount of emotional dysregulation. So even me getting the space to go in the shower and wash my hair felt like a spa day. And sometimes it's those little things personally for me that make such a huge difference. Luckily now I get a bit more space, but even like that space to wash my hair and have that time to just decompress in the shower helped to fill my cup up enough to be able to respond to him. But without that, at times I did find it quite difficult.
You mentioned there about the cognitive load and being overwhelmed with elements. So as parents, we're often juggling so many layers of stress, I guess. So work or relationships, daily logistics, and we're not always going to get it right in the moment. So we hear phrases like the rupture and repair a lot in parenting spaces, but what does that actually look like in practice? And how can we come back and connect with our child after we've lost our calm?
So I think the rupture and repair side of things very much goes back to having that space with your child to repair some of the difficulties you've experienced from that rupture side of things. So it's going back to being able to say sorry when you've perhaps got things wrong, modeling self-compassion, modeling being imperfect. And again, going back to what I said before about helping them to form a positive narrative around you not managing your emotions rather than them being the center of the problem. And I suppose that repair side of things could happen in a number of ways. It could be around having a big cuddle, it could be around having that conversation, but also that is a huge connection moment between you and your child. And when I've listened to other podcasts and them talking about the importance of repair after rupture, they've talked about how that is actually so healing for your relationship, and actually it makes your relationship stronger between you and your child. And I think that's a huge point to consider as well, because I think sometimes we can feel so much guilt when we lose it and when we don't handle things. But actually, the most important element out of all of this is the repair. If you are able to repair that relationship, if you're able to come to your child, give them a big hug if that's what they respond to, and say, do you know what? I did not get this right. That is so important for your relationship with your child more than anything else, because whatever happens in that situation, it's always repairable.
You just mentioned modeling. Can you actually explain that a bit more?
Yeah, of course. So one of the theories I always come back to is social learning theory by Bandura, and it's based on the idea that we copy the behaviors of others, especially adults. It's based on quite a controversial study that some of you might already be aware of, which is the Bobo doll experiment that was in the 1960s before any ethical procedures were put in place. But what happened was children observed adults behaving in a certain way towards a Bobo doll. So children either observed an adult being aggressive towards the Bobo doll, an adult being gentle and caring towards a Bobo doll, and then there was a control group where they didn't observe anything. And what they actually found was that the children who observed the aggressive adult, even though they didn't know this adult at all, they carried out a lot more aggressive acts. So they copied a lot more aggressive acts on the Bobo doll in comparison to the other groups. So the group where they watched the kind model and the control group. So it shows even just watching one episode of someone behaving in a certain way towards a Bobo doll, that then influenced the behavior of the children and then how they responded to the Bobo doll themselves. Now, obviously, there's criticism that you could talk about in terms of this research, and that you could argue Bobo doll could be seen as a toy and it's an inanimate object. But I suppose it gives a clear message around children in terms of what they observe, they're more likely to copy themselves. And little people are always watching, they're always listening. And we see that all the time with our children in how they copy certain things. A funny one that my little boy is doing recently is sometimes my husband can find things a little bit difficult at times. And so like when my little boy is messy or when he spills food on the floor. So I jokingly said to him, oh, we don't want daddy to freak out. And then he now will say to me, we don't want daddy to freak out, and we'll laugh. So yeah, it just goes to show that even we can say something that in our minds at the time seems really innocent, but actually they pick up on these things so quickly. And so when we respond in a way that is shouty, or say, for example, if an adult hit another child, then children are then more likely to copy those behaviors because they've seen those behaviors modeled.
Can I just ask you there quickly? Sorry, is this all negative behaviors you're relating to?
Absolutely not, because with the Bobo doll that observed the positive behaviors, children were much more likely to then copy the positive behaviors of the adult. And I suppose we see this day to day with our children. So I suppose if we model tidying up, we often then see our children copying us tidying up, or my little boy likes to use the Hoover. And things like that, that when they observe us doing things, they often copy it, whether it's positive or more negative behaviors. And I suppose tying into managing big emotions, children observe how we respond when we experience big emotions, so they're more likely to copy that. So they're more likely to copy shouting. If we are more physical, they're more likely to copy those behaviors.
So I just have have one more question for you. Probably I have a lot more, but I'm just thinking we're kind of understanding the elements of stress and the elements of kids will be able to pick up on our stress and our, well, outbursts sometimes. What about in a real life situation? We're out in public, your kid's tired, or your kid's trying to bite another child, or your shopping bag's exploded, or your kid's screaming that they want chocolate, and you're mentally calculating when dinner's actually going to happen. In those messy, overstimulating moments, how on earth are parents meant to stay grounded and sane? And how are we meant to actually be emotionally regulated in real time?
It's so difficult, isn't it? We've all been there where we've been really busy in a public space where our child is emotionally dysregulated, whether it's them throwing themselves on the floor, whether it's screaming. We've all been there, and it creates a really heightened situation. And it's really difficult. And sometimes I think our instinct is to respond in an emotionally dysregulated way ourselves, or to, I suppose, feel pressure to respond in a certain way so other people don't think, oh, they're a bad parent, even though they probably never would think that. But in our minds, we often think, oh gosh, they're going to think I'm such a bad parent. They're going to think I can't control my child. And actually, taking a step back from that and getting out of our own heads in that situation is probably one of the best things we can do. I think there's a number of elements for me, I think, that are really important in terms of kind of thinking about supporting ourselves in these situations. And I suppose in managing any big emotions, and well, I say managing, it's more responding to kind of big emotions from our children. And I think one of them is how we perceive our child's emotions can be really, really influential. And what I mean by that is the lens that we are looking through in terms of understanding our child's emotions. So if we have the mindset that our children are experiencing difficulties handling themselves, or experiencing difficulties in managing these big emotions because the emotion center of the brain has taken over. If we compare that to having a lens of, oh, they're just behaving like a spoiled brat, your response is going to be really quite different. And I think sometimes we can have a huge misunderstanding around a child's emotional response or a toddler's emotional response. And we often feel that need to control their behaviors in that situation. And when we're not able to control their behaviors, because often it's impossible in that moment, we then see ourselves as a failure. But actually, if we can take a step back from that and really think, do you know what? At this moment in time, this is a typical toddler response. This is a typical child response. And then kind of rely then on strategies that you then have in your toolbox to be able to respond. And then hopefully, if you're able to kind of rely on those strategies or take that step back for a minute, breathe. I know in our last episode, we talked about stops not, and really giving yourself that moment and giving yourself that space and that grace in that moment, and remembering that it's not personal. The way that they're responding isn't about you. It's about them just experiencing such intense emotions that they just cannot cope and manage with that situation. And they're just overspilling with emotions. So taking that step back can be so important. One of the other things that, I mean, this wouldn't necessarily be in a public space, it would probably be more at home. But I think sometimes acknowledging our own limits is important. And I suppose this goes back to knowing that we might have certain triggers, or knowing that in certain situations, we're going to notice ourselves bubbling. We're going to notice that, we're going to notice that frustration really bubbling, and being able to recognize that for ourselves. And especially if you're co-parenting, knowing that you need to take a step back in that moment. So knowing that, okay, I need a minute to myself to be able to regulate myself before I can deal with this situation. Or if you're co-parenting, maybe having a code word between you to indicate, I need a minute, can you take over? It can take some work and some time to be able to recognize that you're frustrated, and to be able to recognize that you need someone else to step in. But actually, how powerful is that to have that insight in that moment to recognize, okay, I'm not going to handle this the best way I possibly can, so I need you to step in and take over. But also, if you are finding it difficult to acknowledge that, and if you can agree with your partner, oh, actually, if you notice I'm not handling things, can you have a code word to use to say, right, I need to take over because I can see things are are really bubbling and things are escalating. And I suppose that can be difficult in itself as well, because if someone's emotionally charged and then someone else is coming in saying, you're not handling this, it's having that agreement between the two of you that actually this is what we need for the best interests of our child. We're not perfect. We don't always get it right. And sometimes we need to help and support each other in these really tricky, stressful situations. But yeah, I thought that was a really nice idea around really supporting one another in those moments if you are in a co-parenting situation. Another one that I often talk about as well is the use of scripts. Using scripts in those situations where you know you're going to find it triggering, or you know you might experience difficulties in regulating your emotions in that situation. So, for example, when your child is experiencing big emotions, sometimes it can be so tempted to be like, right, stop that. Is it better to have a script where you acknowledge their feelings first? So I can see you're having a really hard time right now. You're really struggling with your emotions. Why don't we, whatever the solution is? Or if your child has just hit you, having scripts like, I cannot let you hit me, but let me use my kind hands to take you away from this situation and let's go do something else. But having those scripts to fall back on reduces the likelihood that we're going to end up responding in that emotionally charged way. Obviously, it doesn't guarantee it. And again, we're human and things don't always go to plan or how we would ideally want them to. But having those scripts to fall back on can be a bit of a security blanket for those situations when we are finding things quite difficult.
Some of those scripts, I think we're going to have to write them down because sometimes we don't really know what the script actually is. So maybe we can write them down and put them in our social media so that people can actually be able to take a look at those. One script I personally use is actually from, I think it's Dr. Becky. My number one job is to keep you safe. And she knows that. And she can say it back to me now because I've said it so many times to her. But I think scripts would be actually a great way to hopefully empower them and put that into their toolbox and help them in those stressful situations.
I really like that one actually. And the word safe itself, Kate Silverton talks about this in There's No Such Thing as Naughty. Safe is a word that switches on the prefrontal cortex because it's a trigger for the child that, oh, my parent has my best interests at heart. The word safe automatically activates that part of the brain. So that's a really good one. I like that one.
Okay. Well, as we wrap up today's episode, we just want to leave you with this, I guess. Parenting isn't about perfection and it's about presence. We're all going to have hard days and there are moments where we're going to feel overwhelmed, stretched too thin, and probably that we've missed the mark or effed up. But grace matters and repair is powerful. And every time you slow down, reconnect, or simply offer yourself a little compassion, that's the real work. So take time for your child, of course, but also for yourself. Your emotional well-being isn't a luxury, it's actually a primary foundation. If this episode has resonated with you, we'd love you to take a moment to subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share it with a fellow parent who might need a little bit of extra grace today. And as we said, we're going to share those scripts on our social media. So if you're looking for more support, practical tools, or just honest conversations about messy beauty of parenting, come and find us on Instagram at Damn Parenting Podcast. We're building a community there and you're warmly invited. So Faye, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
And everyone else, we're all doing better than we actually think. We'll speak to you next time.